Welcome to today's Explainer. We're going to uncover the surprising, honestly pretty radical roots of the American anti-slavery movement. You know, we often think of history in these neat, tidy little boxes, right? Well, today we are going to break one of those boxes wide open.
So, let's dive right in by challenging a massive historical assumption. I mean, if you ask almost anyone when the abolition movement started, they'll usually point to the 1800s, right leading up to the Civil War. But the fascinating truth? This fight actually started centuries earlier, literally right alongside the foundation of the colonies themselves. It was a localized, fierce, and surprisingly early battle for human rights.
We'll be tracing this hidden history through the roots of colonial slavery, the Quakers and early protests, some incredibly radical voices, slave uprisings and strict slave codes, and finally, the lasting legacy of early abolition.
Part 1. The Roots of Colonial Slavery. To really understand the pushback, we first have to understand how slavery established its terrible grip on those early English colonies. Just look at how quickly this terrifying expansion escalated. It starts in 1619, when an English privateer ship called the White Lion traded captive Africans for food in Virginia, which is widely viewed as the first time the transatlantic slave trade reached America. Then, just a bit later, after the Pequot War in the 1630s, we see displaced Native American survivors being sold into slavery. And by 1655, the Dutch were holding widespread, completely public slave auctions right in New Amsterdam, which of course is what we now know as New York City. Slavery was just rapidly becoming woven into the very fabric of colonial life.
Now, what's really fascinating here is the geographic contrast that starts taking shape. As the original 13 colonies developed, they were heavily divided by economics and geography. The southern colonies became incredibly dependent on plantation slave labor, but the northern and middle colonies, they simply didn't rely on that same agricultural model. And because they were way less economically dependent on enslaved labor, these northern and middle colonies actually became fertile ground for anti-slavery sentiment to start taking root.
Moving on to Part 2, Quakers and early protests. That regional economic difference we just talked about perfectly set the stage for religious groups, specifically in Pennsylvania, to become the very first organized voices of protest.
Watch how this resistance builds within the Quaker community, also known as the Religious Society of Friends. Quakers strongly believed in the inner light, meaning God was present within every single individual, completely regardless of their background. The momentum starts out a bit mildly in 1657, with founder George Fox basically just advising his followers to, treat slaves well and maybe consider freeing them. But then, by 1688, 4 Quaker men draft the incredibly significant Germantown Petition against slavery, which boldly declared enslaved Africans as social equals. Over the decades, this momentum just kept building and building until 1758, when the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting literally excluded slave traders from leadership roles. They were finally putting their beliefs into real, tangible action.
So the crucial thing to remember is that this religious shift wasn't happening in isolation. It coincided with the First Great Awakening, which was a massive religious revival sweeping through all 13 colonies from the 1730s to the 1760s. Now, while evangelists didn't always preach explicitly against slavery, they did emphasize the power of the individual and the opportunity for every single person to be saved by God's grace. And this planted a highly dangerous, totally revolutionary idea for the time, that all people were fundamentally equal.
And this growing belief in equality, it sparked a ton of written protests across the colonies. Over in Boston, Judge Samuel Sewall published a piece arguing that all descendants of Adam had the absolute right to liberty. We also see William Southby formally petitioning for complete emancipation in Pennsylvania, and John Hepburn in New Jersey publishing essays on the unlawfulness of making slaves of men. These weren't just, quiet thoughts kept in private journals. These were public, documented demands for freedom spreading all across the middle and northern colonies.
Part 3, Radical Voices and Shifting Views. Because, as you can imagine, polite essays, pamphlets, and petitions simply weren't enough for everyone. Some early abolitionists decided it was time to take deeply radical, frankly shocking actions to make their point. Enter the fiery, super provocative Quaker abolitionist Benjamin Lay in the 1730s. He felt those gradual moral arguments were just way too slow, so he took extreme measures. Lay actually kidnapped a slave-owning family's child,
Now, he didn't harm the child, but he temporarily took them just to force the parents to physically feel the agonizing pain of a stolen child, which of course was the exact same pain they were inflicting on enslaved families every single day.
In 1737, Lay continued his crusade by publishing a book with this incredibly provocative title, literally calling slave keepers apostates. But what's really fascinating here is who printed it. This fiery anti-slavery text was actually printed by none other than a young Benjamin Franklin. Pretty wild, right?
And if you thought the kidnapping stunt was wild, wait until you hear about his 1738 protest. Lay showed up to the Philadelphia yearly meeting dressed in full military uniform. He carried a sword and a book that looked like a Bible, but he had actually hollowed out a secret compartment and filled it with a red liquid. Right in front of everyone, he plunged the sword into the book and literally splashed fake blood all over the Quaker leaders to condemn their hypocrisy for owning slaves. He was promptly escorted out, for sure, but he definitely made sure nobody could ignore his message.
The crazy part is these extreme, highly theatrical actions actually worked to slowly shift the Overton window of public views. This growing anti-slavery ideology inspired vital black abolitionist leaders, like Prince Hall in Boston, and the social pressure became so immense that it even started convincing prominent slave owners, including founding fathers like George Washington, that they needed to emancipate their slaves in their wills. The seeds of a massive cultural shift had absolutely been planted.
Part 4. Uprisings and strict slave codes. Because while white abolitionists like Lay protested morally, enslaved people themselves were fighting back physically, creating a climate of intense fear among colonial slaveholders.
This physical resistance from the enslaved was constant. Enslaved people were a part of Nathaniel Bacon's army in Virginia back in the 1670s. In 1712, a violent revolt took place in New York where enslaved people set fires and attacked responders. Then in 1739, during the Stono Rebellion in South Carolina, slaves desperately fought to escape down to Spanish Florida, where they were promised freedom. The colonial authorities lived in such total paranoia that by 1741, mere rumors of an uprising in New York led to a Salem witch trial-style conspiracy where dozens of innocent people were executed.
In terrified reaction to these physical uprisings, colonial governments systematically cracked down. Instead of reflecting on the morality of slavery, they created harsh slave codes, sometimes called black laws, literally stripping away fundamental human rights step by step. They took away weapons, limited associations, and explicitly banned enslaved people from receiving an education. It was an oppressive legal framework designed purely out of fear to maintain absolute control. Part 5. The Legacy of Early Abolition. Let's look at how this intense, roughly 150-year push and pull between the brutal expansion of slavery and the fierce ongoing resistance define the future of America.
When we look back, the early seeds planted by documents like the Germantown Petition and those theatrical protests of radical figures weren't just, footnotes in colonial history. They were the absolute catalyst for an ideological struggle. They established a profound moral and economic divide between the North and the South, a huge fracture that would ultimately tear the United States apart in the 1860s.
So I want to leave you with this final thought to ponder today. If the moral arguments were completely formed and the physical resistance to slavery was this fierce back in colonial times, why in the world did it take a brutal civil war more than 2 centuries later to finally end the institution? Just think about how deeply entrenched economic systems can resist moral progress. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history you think you know.